Okay, well, good evening. To begin, we acknowledge that the land on which we are learning, working, and gathering today is the ancestral home of the Okokomoko and Piscataway peoples. We acknowledge that St. Mary's City was partly built and sustained by enslaved people of African descent. And through this acknowledgement, we recognize these communities and all those who have been displaced and enslaved through colonization. Given the unique importance of the land on which we sit and given the unique educational mission of St. Mary's College of Maryland as the National Public Honors College, we pledge to continue to unearth and understand these historic realities so that they inform all our work. We also pledge to work tirelessly in making our institution more accessible, inclusive, and equitable, especially for those populations most affected by societal inequities. We do this with the understanding that by supporting and learning from all our diverse communities, we build a more sustainable future for all. Good evening and welcome to the latest offering in the Media Literacy, Civic Engagement, and Democracy Project. Tonight's program features Renee DiResta. Before proceeding, I want to ask those of you in attendance in person to please observe the college's COVID protocols and keep your masks on throughout the duration of the program. Thank you for complying with the safety precautions. Now, many of you may recognize Renee DiResta from our last program in the Media Literacy, Civic Engagement, and Democracy Project. She was featured in The Social Dilemma, which we screened on September 21st. We are very pleased to have her here with us tonight virtually and learn from her talk, The Long Fuse and the Big Lie, Misinformation, and the 2020 election. Our hope is that we will be able to discuss this critical issue with her as we prepare for the elections of 2022 and beyond. Renee is the Technical Research Manager at the Stanford Internet Observatory, a cross-disciplinary program of research, teaching, and policy engagement for the study of abuse in current information technologies. She studies the spread of malign narratives across social and media networks. Her work examines the ways in which distinct actor types leverage the information ecosystem to exert influence, from local activists to promoting health misinformation and conspiracy theories, to well-resourced full spectrum information operations executed by state-sponsored actors. Renee has advised Congress, the State Department, and other academic, civic, and business organizations. For example, at the behest of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, she led outside teams investigating both the Russia-linked Internet Research Agency's multi-year effort to manipulate American society and elections, and the GRU influence campaign deployed alongside its hack and leak operations in the 2016 election. Renee is also an ideas contributor at Wired and The Atlantic, and she has a really interesting piece in The Atlantic this week. I encourage you to read it. She's an Emerson Fellow, a 2019 Truman National Security Project Fellow, a 2019 Mozilla Fellow in Media, Misinformation, and Trust, and a Council on Foreign Relations term member. Thank you, Renee, for joining us today. I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here virtually. I'm actually on Stanford's campus at the moment. This is my temporary office. Let me see. Let me see how I can. I'm going to click the share screen button here, and then we can go from there. So today I'm going to talk about the dynamics that we saw through a joint partnership. Oh, can somebody let me share screen? I have a host participant disabled button, so just give me access to the share option.
You should be able to share now.
Okay. Oh, yep, there we go. All right. All right, let's do this. Okay. And okay. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the dynamics that we saw in the 2020 election as part of a joint research project called the Election Integrity Partnership. And in Q&A, I'm more than happy to talk about some of the other things with regard to state-sponsored activity or the content in the social dilemma. At SIO, we work both on things like trust and safety, which encompasses how people as individuals experience the internet. We also work on things like mis and disinformation at a societal level. So looking at a few different kind of scopes for the problem. So I'm going to focus on the latter in this talk and walk through some of the things that we saw in 2020, ahead of 2022. So in about midway through 2020, we identified a need for a collaboration that would be able to follow voting-related misinformation narratives on social networks with the intent to take action on them by surfacing them for community members and stakeholders that had the potential to actually counter the narratives or intervene in some way. So we decided that we were going to do this kind of experimental affiliation of institutions with the intent to detect and mitigate the impact of false and misleading narratives related to voting. And we decided to do this because we felt that while oftentimes academic research in many centers tends to focus on academic papers, one of the things that we're scoped for at SIO is this detection process. And while detection and reporting and communicating back and forth with platforms is interesting, and we learn a lot through our studies of information operations identified on the platforms, at the same time, with the 2020 election in particular, we felt that it would be beneficial to try to create a multi-stakeholder relationship that would enable us to communicate what we were seeing in as close to real time as possible to both tech platforms and to government stakeholders that were tasked with defending the election. And so we formed this consortium. It was Stanford Internet Observatory, our team. It was Graphica, which is a tech company that produces really excellent abilities to map communities and conversations on the internet. DFR Lab is Digital Forensics Research Lab of the Atlantic Council, which also studies information operations. And then the last group is Washington University Center for an Informed Public. For those of you who follow mis and disinformation research, that's Kate Starbird's team. They do amazing work. And the four of us together had different kind of technical capabilities, different alignments, ways that we saw the problem. We decided that by creating this consortium, what we could do was create an ecosystem whereby different stakeholders, such as government, civil society, and media, who saw interesting emergent content, false and misleading narratives narrowly scoped to voting, could flag it for us in addition to our own analysts going through a proactive detection process. This would then go into an intake team where we would study the content, we would look at it, we would understand the dynamics. Was it going viral? Was it just fizzling out? Was it increasing? Was the rate of velocity of transmission increasing? Who was an active participant in the creation of the narrative, the documentation of the incident? And then with that assessment, we could flag for the folks on the other end of the stakeholder queue, which was platforms, government, civil society, media, and our own website. We could write rapid responses, and we could create this partnership, this process by which we had these intake queues. We triaged those tickets, we understood what was happening, and then we in turn communicated our understanding of the problem to these other entities. We didn't make recommendations to them. It was simply, hey, you who work in election integrity in the state of Arizona may want to be aware that this narrative is emerging within your state. And so this was the kind of first pass at one of these multi-stakeholder partnerships. We currently have one going now called the Virality Project. We are going to do this again in 2022 with some adjustments, but this overall was our attempt at practicalizing the kind of detection work that we do and trying to operationalize it so that it was relevant in the very near term. So over the course of from about July until what wound up being January, not November, we followed the narratives related to voting in the context of the election. And we had kind of 5 key areas of findings that we put out in this long report called The Long Fuse. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those findings today, both how we got there kind of methodologically and also what they were as a kind of glimpse and understanding of what happened in 2020 as we think ahead to 2022. So we were interested in dynamics that we saw related to how narratives were created, what we called bottom-up versus top-down dynamics. That's what my essay in the Atlantic from this last weekend is about, this change in dynamics of who precipitates incidents and makes and gets attention to them? Is it media communicating to the public, or is it the public surfacing content that media then picks up? We looked at what we called repeat spreaders, the idea that there were certain influencers who were actively involved in many, many incidents of false and misleading information. Some interesting policy questions there. There's some interesting design questions there related to what happens when we see this dynamic of recurring offenders. We observed that the vast majority, the overwhelming majority, in fact, was coming from domestic, not foreign actors. And we observed ways in which platform policy and platform affordances enabled the propagation of false and misleading narratives. And the reason that we did that was with an eye towards potentially having the ability to influence or impact policy going forward to try to mitigate at a higher level, as opposed to playing, whack-a-mole with each of the individual narratives or false claims. So I'll start with kind of point one, which was this question of how are narratives formed and what did we see most in 2020? So there's a lot of very accurate research that argues that media is an integral part in the misinformation process, and that's very true. One of the things that we try to understand is the relationship between media and social media and how these narratives spread. One thing that we saw that was very interesting was, on a recurring basis, this process by which ordinary individual people, just average everyday people who happen to be at a polling location, would create content using their phone. Most often they would take a picture, they would take a short video, maybe they would record some audio, and they would create content documenting what we called incidents. And an incident was kind of a discrete moment that often would precipitate a very kind of discrete piece of content, which then in turn was disseminated, and it would hit mainstream platforms, alternative platforms. It would go through chat, chat services like WhatsApp. And there would be this process of creation, dissemination, amplification. So again, you'd create the content documenting your incident. You would push it out and disseminate it to as many platforms as possible. There would be this amplification process where politically aligned influencers and communities who thought that these incidents would help their side would pick them up and would work to amplify them to get attention. There would be this sort of virality threshold where it would kind of reach massive numbers of people. And one thing that we saw, interestingly, was that there would then be some sort of non-social media action that was taken. So mainstream media would cover it, and you would see that incident make its way up to the nightly news. Or there would be a protest, so the incident would precipitate some kind of in the streets action, or there would be, oftentimes the incident was incorporated into a legal action or a lawsuit, oftentimes alleging fraud, and would be used as evidence. And so there was this process that we saw over and over and over again. You may remember, some of you, if you paid attention, these allegations that of ballot fraud and things like that. And so we would see these allegations happening time and time again through this very repetitive process. So then we started thinking about that in aggregate, which is how did the incidents form narratives? So any individual incident or moment or piece of content was woven into a broader narrative, usually a narrative of fraud. And we would look at ways in which things would come from the top down sometimes, where a partisan or other media organization would report on something, and major key players would put that content out, would comment on it, and then the public would pick it up and share it and discuss it. The other side that was happening, though, is what I've described with this, the public initiates this process of collective sense making by taking the incident that an ordinary person has recorded on their cell phone, beginning to discuss it, trying to make sense of it, and then tagging in influencers saying, hey, have you seen this, with big blue check accounts on Twitter in particular, with very prominent large audiences, so prominent people with large audiences. And then it would make its way up from a different direction. So this was not media reporting on the guy who found a ballot in a ditch. It instead would be, man finds what he thinks is ballot in a ditch, tags in the relevant political influencer who is aligned with his side and his interpretation of this event, and then works to bump it up the chain so that mainstream media begins to cover it. So this is a very different dynamic, that creation process whereby people are shaping the ways in which mainstream media talks about these narratives. And we were interested in the distinction between top down and bottom up and where the origination process was. One example of this that I'll just walk through very quickly, because it covers a lot of different areas, was SHARPIEGATE. So SHARPIEGATE started off as an allegation that people were being given markers in Arizona, felt tip pens, Sharpie markers, and they were bleeding through the ballots. And people were very concerned that what this meant was that their ballot wasn't being counted. Now, even early on, very, very early on, the Maricopa County Election Department in Arizona was trying to put out kind of alerts saying, hey, you can use Sharpies, the ink doesn't smudge, you're perfectly fine. So this was the official blue checked elections department. They were putting this out on Twitter, but they were also putting it out on Facebook. But what we start to see is this, the significant peak in tweets about Sharpies. So election day is the 3rd. So this is kind of over prior to, of course, this big spike. But what you start to see is on election day, it's just kind of like a nascent chatter. People are debating what is happening, but it hasn't really metastasized yet. One thing that's interesting, though, is, of course, there are these the people who are sharing this content. Many of them are Trump supporters. They begin to read in the idea that this county is being targeted with these Sharpie markers and the officials are lying to them because they are Trump supporters. And this is part of what they've been conditioned to believe through months and months of then President Trump's tweets saying the election is going to be stolen. And so what you start to see is people who have been primed to believe that the election is going to be stolen begin to talk about this process of their Sharpie marker. And here's an example of a ballot bleed through, saying that this is actually really part of a bigger conspiracy. So the way in which this begins to manifest is you start to see concerns. People are saying, hey, I asked for a different kind of pen and I wasn't given one. And this process of trying to make sense of what's happening gets kind of increasingly angry. So what we start to get is by 9:00 p.m. or so, you start to see there's voter fraud in Maricopa County, Arizona. They were ripping pens out of people's hands and telling them to use the Sharpies. Now, that's probably highly unlikely, but what you start to see again is the incorporation of people who have been primed to believe a certain thing, some small concern, because again, the Sharpies do bleed through, despite the fact the ballots are offset, so the bleed through doesn't actually affect the votes on the other side. The marks are not, they're not obscuring or interfering with the other candidates on the other side. The election officials are in there, they're trying to fact check, they're trying to get this out. Local media begins to report, trying to get this out. But then you start to see prominent figures in the kind of conservative ecosystem who say, apparently this is causing huge numbers of ballots to be invalidated. So now all of a sudden we begin to see allegations of fraud very directly. And then by kind of early on November 4th, now keep in mind the election at this point has been called for Trump by some outlets at this point. Arizona has been called for Trump, I should say. And the people in Arizona, particularly Trump supporters, decide that this is actually part of a vast conspiracy. They go and they're looking to try to understand whether or not their vote was counted. And interestingly, you start to see again, they're primed to believe this thing. What she's checking here is the ballot by mail early ballot information, which says canceled. She misinterprets that to believe that her actual ballot was canceled. But you see that even though the kind of contradiction to the claim is right there in the evidence in the screenshot that she shows into tweet, it still gets 14,000 likes. It still gets 11,000 retweets. And so we're kind of off to the races by this point. And people are really just amplifying any evidence that they can find or any individual anecdote expressing this belief that Arizona has been stolen. So yeah, so what starts to happen then, of course, is the initial reports of the Sharpie issues that were happening on election day are actually, again, as you can see in this little blue box, very, very small. But what starts to happen is you start to see prominent influencers come in, and that's what makes the story go viral. So you have all of these kind of ground level contributions from people with like Make America Great Again and their profiles expressing this concern that their vote has been stolen. They really sincerely feel this. This is not machinations. This is groups of people, communities of people communicating about this, trying to figure out what happens. And then what we start to see is this kind of anonymous person produces that tweet that I just showed you with the 14,000 retweets. And then you start to see prominent influencers begin to pick it up. It goes to Charlie Kirk of Turning Point USA, and it goes to Donald Trump Jr. And then all of a sudden we hit this point where this is a viral trend, this allegation about the Sharpie. And so this is this interesting process. Then what winds up happening is conservative media begins to look into it, the kind of hyper-partisan media layer, saying some people are saying in Arizona there was fraud. And this is the process by which this narrative then goes viral. And there were that evening, November 4th, the night of November 4th, there were protests in Arizona outside of the Maricopa County voting facility, the elections office, alleging that their votes had all been stolen and demanding some sort of redress. And so this is how, again, you get from this, this kind of concern, that my ballot has been, rendered useless because of this bleed through problem. The rejection of, even though the fact check is out there, the rejection of that fact check, the people who've been primed to believe that there is theft, interpreting what they're seeing as theft, and then the massive viral moment that starts to grow out of that. So that is one anecdote, or one, I should say, one narrative precipitated by a handful of these incidents that were documented, these people taking pictures of their ballots in Arizona. And we saw that over and over and over again. And so one of the things that the UW team looked at in particular was this question of repeat spreaders. And so this is a graph from the UW team, who, as part of the EIP consortium, was looking at this question of how many of our tickets, our documentation of these incidents and narratives were precipitated by the same people. And I don't have time to go into it in a half-hour talk, but this is in our report, The Long Fuse. The answer is actually quite a few. And what you see is the same blue check influencers who consistently manage to find these anecdotes from ordinary people alleging a ballot in a garbage can, a ballot in a dumpster, on election day, allegations that a voting machine isn't working or that there's fraud from Sharpie markers. All of this kind of coalesces into the Stop the Steal movement, the hashtag Stop the Steal. All of these different threads, dead voters. There is a theory that people's maiden names were being used to secretly register them in close states so that the Democrats could commit fraud using the maiden names of these voters. Now, there was no evidence of any of this, but there were these kind of documented screenshots or misinterpreted login responses and things like this that come these massive moments. And it was consistently over and over and over again, the same people, the same influencers who were really amplifying it. And then these clusters of accounts that were serving the kind of digital crowd that were serving as the amplifiers, kind of bumping it back and forth amongst themselves for that bottom up momentum. So interestingly, after January 6th, this is another graph, again, created by Andrew Beers of UW Center for an Informed Public. And that was the same. So this was the accounts as we pulled them in November, as we were doing this kind of culmination of the election report, and then running it again after January 6th. At that point, Twitter shut down 70,000 accounts. And those are the black dots. And as you can see, that very highly active community over there to the left, which much of that was QAnon, basically gets sort of decimated by this action that takes place after the fact, as QAnon begins to be lumped into the dangerous orgs kind of facets of the platform, particularly as manifestations of real-world violence begin to increase. So it's sort of an interesting culmination to how these networks that were highly active and precipitating these narratives during the election were dealt with after January 6th. Foreign actors were in there, so I think that's also important to briefly touch on. Overwhelmingly domestic, but because anybody can use this ecosystem, anyone can reach the public, anyone can precipitate and spread a narrative, what we do see is the presence of foreign actors participating in the process as well. So we have from Russia, we have the creation of a couple of fake media properties, front media properties that are pretending to be independent news sources. Now, again, anyone can create an independent news source today. It doesn't take much work. You just throw up a get a domain, throw up a Facebook page, make a Twitter account, and then you've got all the trappings of these sort of citizen journalism type dynamics. Create a little brand for yourself. And so Russia was doing that as well. And so they created these properties, one on the left, one on the right. And then they succeeded in hiring these unwitting freelancers who didn't know that the outreach for this brand new independent press was in fact Russian trolls. And so that is the dynamic that we see from Russia. So instead of making a whole bunch of fake social media accounts, they choose to go this sort of fake independent news entity. They did create a bunch of accounts on other social platforms that haven't been as good at taking them down. And so you do encounter their social media accounts pretending to be Americans on slight, platforms that don't really believe in moderation or don't believe in certain types of moderation, like Gab and Parler. So another usage of the ecosystem was Iran creating these accounts pretending to be the Proud Boys. So in a very interesting manifestation, they pretended to be the Proud Boys, which is a right-wing group, a kind of a little bit challenging to describe, I think, kind of nationalist. And so this dynamic was, the sort of right-wing group that Trump had signaled to during the debates, saying, Proud Boys stand by. And so all of a sudden, Iran pretends to be the Proud Boys and sends emails to Democrats from the Proud Boys, kind of alleging that they'll get hurt if they vote. And so there are these, they receive these emails instructing them to vote for Donald Trump. There's also some, we know who you are because somebody hacked the voting database, it turns out to be an old video. But what you start to see is the real kind of false flag operation of the 2020 election comes from Iran, not from Russia. And then the China-based operation, sort of the third entity that is very persistent in the information operations space, is China. Interestingly, again, they don't spend very much time trying to sow division. They just spend a lot of time producing content, and most of it is to make China look good and the US look bad. That is always the model of the Chinese propaganda communications, even the overt communications, that's their strategy. And so we do start to see that, but it's these very kind of, these lousy, they don't get very much reach, they don't get very much engagement, but they're there kind of on the periphery. So we do look at all of these things, the question of top down, bottom up, foreign, domestic, because again, if you want to reach people, if you want to influence an election, there's a really easy set, really accessible, I should say, set of tools with which you can do it. And so this is why we felt that this multi-institution effort, DFR Lab, with its expertise in detecting foreign operations, our kind of technological expertise in surfacing content, UW's really sophisticated rapid Twitter analysis to understand the networks and Graphicas as well, created this environment whereby we could find and surface and understand these things and then ensure that relevant partners whose job it was to deal with them had situational awareness and received some communication indicating that these things were happening, and then additional kind of independent analysis of what was going on. And then the kind of final piece of the main key findings was this idea of policies shape propagation. So what determined whether a narrative was propagated, if you remember in my slides there with the many, many thousands of accounts that then were taken down after January 6th, you have this dynamic from the bottom up where you have the crowd, right, the ordinary people who are passionate about amplifying their side. That's not happening algorithmically. They want the algorithm to pick their stuff up. They want the trending algorithm in particular to pick their stuff up. They want to have active groups that the recommendation engine pushes forward. But what's happening is not actually an algorithm problem. What's happening is that everybody has the tools to surface what they want to surface by hitting the retweet button or by hitting the like or the share button, creating engagement around particular types of content. So this means that even as we talk about regulatory efforts related to recommendations and how feeds should be sorted and the things that have come about as a function of the conversation happening today since the Facebook whistleblower emerged about a week ago, 2 weeks ago now. What you see is this dynamic by which policies are really shaping propagation, the tools that people have, the policies around what is okay to do or say on the platform really become the kind of, they're setting the rules of the game. They're the primary determinants in what is going to go viral. Sometimes the policies relate to coordination among accounts. Sometimes the policies relate to the substance of the content. So there's different areas in which we see platforms trying to mitigate the most harmful false and misleading information in the context of voting. And so we studied the policies as they evolved over time. And we looked at the evolution of the policies. So when the election, when our election work started in the summer of 2020, what were platform policies like regarding the spread of false claims about voting? There were anti-voter suppression policies that were very specific. You can't lie and say the election is on a Wednesday. You can't send somebody information that directs them to a false polling place, that kind of thing. But this question of just the sort of mass allegations of fraud and things like that, those policies really evolved over time, particularly as these narratives kept surfacing because they were kind of originally permitted. And then as time went on, there were different rules related to labeling or takedowns of content alleging voter fraud or election theft. So some of our policy team assessed the extent to which policies were uniform or consistent even across the social media ecosystem. Now, of course, every platform develops its policy in its own way and, per its values, per its business model, per its feature set. But what we were looking at was trying to understand roughly thematically across however it might manifest on different features, was there sort of consensus across the social media big tech environment around what type of content or behavior was permissible, what type was just activism and speech and expression versus what type veered into the realm of the manipulative or the exploitive or the overly coordinated where something needed to be, where the accounts needed to be addressed. So we tried to understand the gray areas there, and then we identified some areas for improvement, arguing for more transparency, particularly more transparency in what is enforced and when and why, but also more transparency so that people have visibility ahead of having to, as they're trying to decide how to operate on a platform. One thing you do see is people who are very confused because they are sharing content and then they don't understand why Twitter locks their account. Or why Facebook deletes their comment, or if they're an admin, locks their account because of what the people in their group might be doing or shuts down their group, et cetera, et cetera. So people are trying to figure out how to stay on the right side of those lines. In many cases, they're not all trying to deliberately evade them. And so we spent a lot of time looking at this question of propagation. I think I've hit just about 40 minutes of talking. So I am more than happy to take questions on all of these things and to kind of discuss more broadly how election integrity work is looking ahead of 2022, or the ways in which we think that multi-stakeholder relationship can be potentially fleshed out or developed going forward, or whatever's useful to discuss.
Thank you, Renee. So we'd like to open it up to questions. We can, let's see here. If you're here in the audience in person, you can raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you. If you're on Zoom, you can raise your digital hand or add a comment to the chat box, and we'll get to you as well. So please remember to keep our comments and questions civil and remain on topic. Thank you. So, questions? We have some in the chat box. Okay. Okay, Argelia.
Hi, Renee. Thank you very much for your presentation. And I have a question. In one of your presentations, past presentations, you mentioned the term information disorder. And I would like to if you can share with us this. You can explain this term, information disorder, please. And also, if I know that you have a strong opinion about fake news, and I would like also if you can share with us your opinion about fake news, please.
Sure. So information disorder is a term that was put forth by Claire Wardle of First Draft. And First Draft is an organization that helps journalists think about the role, the intersection of media and social media and the responsibilities there. She broached the idea of information disorder in early 2018, I want to say. So there were a lot of people who were, and this ties into, I think, your question about fake news. There were a lot of people who were very concerned about fake news in the 2016 presidential election. There were things that were trending, particularly, I don't even know if people remember this now, but Facebook used to have a trending feature right off to the right. When you were on the desktop view, it was very prominent. And it had tabs for different categories, and you could see what was trending in science or technology or politics or overall. And so what happened in that particular case was there was a purported whistleblower, somebody who left, an employee who had worked on the trending topics team, who recontextualized a platform policy, which was to try to minimize false and misleading claims or minimize sort of viral false stories in that trending pane by having editorial oversight, which is something that, you know, Twitter actually does now with its trending topics now in 2021. There's somebody whose job it is to kind of write in what the trend means, try to contextualize it for the public, try to make sure that things that are trending because like of a spam network don't capture the attention of the public. And so what starts to happen there is conservatives begin to allege that Facebook is censoring them, that this trending topics editorial curation is in fact anti-conservative bias. Now, Glenn Beck and others go to Facebook and they meet with Mark Zuckerberg, and they come away convinced that it is not in fact anti-conservative bias, but Facebook has all of a sudden had this first very political kind of scandal in a sense. And so what Facebook does is they elect to fire all the human curators and to make the trending topics widget algorithm only. And what begins to happen when it's algorithm only is that the things that the curators had been keeping out, which were false news, which at the time meant demonstrably false stories, meaning there was a claim that was falsifiable, the news was fake. It was reporting something that didn't happen. Megyn Kelly gets fired from Fox News was one example. Pope endorses Donald Trump was another example. I remember I have so many screenshots from when that feature was still available, because I periodically DM my friends in Facebook data science and be like, in the science section, there's a Wiccan blog talking about phases of the moon. Like, what are you guys doing? Maybe something is wrong with your classification here. Maybe we should be rethinking that. Maybe firing those people was not the best idea. You know, why is this in science? Put it in like entertainment if it's that popular. But it was a really interesting time because they didn't have a good answer. So what began to happen after President Trump was elected, all of a sudden the question of had all of these viral fake news, meaning demonstrably falsifiable news stories, actually had influence on the public. You remember also during the campaign, there was this complexity where the Clinton campaign was hacked. And so a large part of the conversation towards the end of the campaign, the Russian military intelligence was behind that hack. And the first tranche of emails was dropped the day after Donald Trump's kind of, grab him by the genitals tape was released. And so what winds up happening there is all of a sudden the conversation begins to turn to the substance of these emails. And then this is how kind of wild theories like Pizzagate begin to develop. So interestingly, kind of an outgrowth of this Russian hack is Pizzagate, and then the Russian trolls begin to participate in that conversation. And Pizzagate becomes more and more of a thing, which Facebook's recommendation engine starts to push to people also. So all of a sudden we have this dynamic where those of us who are watching it are saying, okay, we've got a lot of there's these wild false things that are going around. Nobody seems to be responsible for any of this. On election night, platform engineers are publicly tweeting, wondering if maybe they should have done something, maybe there was a problem. And that became, this is the longest answer, but trying to tie all these things together. In mid-2017, begin to realize the extent of Russia's operation on the platform. And that's where you start to see this question of, well, on this platform at this one time, this one moment, we had so many different things swirling around. There was demonstrably falsifiable information by financially motivated people. These were the kind of Macedonian teenagers behind a lot of the fake news blogs. Fake news, until the president commandeered the term, meant demonstrably false stories. And that was a problem. There were no fact checkers or anything like that. People were trying to figure out if that was what we needed. Then there was disinformation, which is a term that refers to a particular strategy that Russia puts forth, this idea of active measures in the creation of fake personas to amplify and to spread and to participate in conversation. So that was happening. And so this was where misinformation, disinformation, Claire also had a term malinformation, which I think was correct information deployed maliciously, which was, I think, her kind of way of framing that that hack and leak operation that had happened, the GRU hack. And so information disorder became the way to summarize the fact that on this one ecosystem, there were so many of these different things that were swirling around, and how might we discuss what the problem was, because it seemed pretty clear that the problem was not just the news, because then you also had the Russians, or not just the Russians, because the media was actually far more impactful in terms of reach. So how do we then think about the role of media and propaganda? And so it became a way to try to encompass all of the different manifestations of false and misleading narratives, or unfalsifiable but highly incendiary propagandist narratives. We weren't using the term propaganda then. This is a thing that has been kind of like something I've been writing a lot about. I actually think that's the term that we should be using, quite honestly. But at the time, this idea that ordinary people and manifestations of like relationships between crowds and influencers was a form of propaganda was, I think, something that was not particularly how the public was willing to think about it. I think it's taken a few years, but we're starting to get to that point now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Renee. We have a chat question.
Yeah, there's 2 questions.
We have a couple of questions in the chat. One from Mackenzie. How do you think Trump would react to this data about the repeat spreaders and the right individuals being primed?
Well, I think he'd be thrilled. It's public. The report is public. Anybody can read it. And Shiva Ayyadurai, who lost his election, and he was running against Elizabeth Warren in Massachusetts for the Senate, lost his election, and then was one of the many people who alleged that his election was stolen, and that the election was stolen, and the myriad of conspiracies behind Stop the Steal. Actually wrote up a whole thing and made a little chart documenting the people and institutions in our report, and alleging that it was part of a vast conspiracy. So I think the idea that people don't know what they're doing, they do know what they're doing, right? This is a way to galvanize a crowd, and populist leaders have galvanized crowds in much the same way around this idea of us versus them, and it's going to be stolen, and they are taking it from you. There's a particular type of populist rhetoric that you see in so much of this, and as it's repeated over and over and over again, people are encouraged to be part of the detection process. There was a thing that we allude to in the report around what was called the Army for Trump. And the Army for Trump was a website that the president and his campaign put up, encouraging people to serve as documentarians of voter fraud. And so one of the things that was happening was that people were not only encouraged in a passive sense through the president's commentary, they were encouraged to actually join these teams, this Army for Trump, this digital warrior group, which had the effect of, psychologically it deputizes people. You're giving them a mission, a calling. You're saying you are going to be one of the people who finds evidence of this, and people really get motivated by that. There's a lot of, honestly, bored people, and then there's a lot of people who are very, very passionate and are looking for meaning in their lives. And the opportunity to have this camaraderie, to be part of this team, propelling a leader that they love back into power was a real motivator. And you could see it in the communications. People were sincerely participating because they really, truly, deeply believed in the cause. And that's one of the real challenges when we think about this, which is that is activism. And so when we think about the dynamics there, the tech platforms produce the infrastructure that people can use to become activists, but in the same way that it can be used for very pro-social movements to bring people together around causes, it does also have this dynamic by which particularly, many populist leaders, I saw another question about Brazil in there, that rhetoric that this is your fight, I am just the figurehead, I represent you, and you can find out the truth. That rhetoric is very common in QAnon as well. So this is effectively populist political dynamics and populist rhetoric reformulated for the affordances of social media.
Great, thank you so much. Maybe we can go on to that question about the comparison between Brazil and in 2022 coming up and the US is back in 2020. If there are similar dynamics at play or new patterns.
Yeah, so Brazil's really an interesting case. We do have a team that is going to be looking at the Brazilian election. So I think we're just gearing up on that. So I don't have a ton of interesting stuff to report yet, but the thing that's different about Brazil is really WhatsApp. So that relationship between kind of beloved populist leader and online crowd is still very much there, and we do see a lot of pro Bolsonaro content on Twitter. Interestingly, they are also on Parler. Our team did do an assessment of we did a look at the first 13 million, I think it was, users on Parler. And among the first 13 million, one of the things that's so great about social media is that all of these people who are truly passionate want to signal their allegiance. And one way that they make their allegiance quite visible is with emojis in bio. And so you can actually tell within like 30 seconds of somebody talking to you on Twitter, like who they are, if they're one of these passionate people, because they'll have their emojis in bio. And so Parler do the same thing on Parler. And so we actually looked at usernames and identified clusters of accounts that had the Brazilian flag, kind of telegraphing that they were there because they were passionate about that. And then I believe Getter was the other app. Parler was largely deplatformed by their providers after January 6th for a variety of reasons. It reconstituted, but in the meantime, this other entity called Getter kind of sprung up in its place, another conservative social network or quote unquote free speech social network. And that network also had, I believe it was Bolsonaro's son, created an account fairly early on. And so a lot of the pro-Bolsonaro supporters who feel themselves disenfranchised or who feel that they're being censored on Twitter or they're losing their accounts on Twitter go and reconstitute on these smaller platforms. So that's one dynamic, but I think the biggest thing is really WhatsApp, which is encrypted and end-to-end encryption. And so the platforms can't see what's moving through it. Fact checkers can't see it unless they happen to be in the group where the content is. There was some pioneering work done in India where WhatsApp tried to set up hotlines with civil society so that people who saw misinformation in WhatsApp groups could kind of flag it for fact checkers, who then in turn could debunk it, if not within WhatsApp, could at least put out articles or news interviews about it and try to fact check it outside of WhatsApp. But WhatsApp's interesting because it doesn't have a recommendation engine, right? It doesn't have a trending function. It doesn't have curation. And it speaks to this dynamic that I was trying to get at a little bit in the talk about this motivation and the people who see it, believe it, and spread it. And that happens over and over and over again. And one of the things that we use to differentiate mis and disinformation a lot of the time is this question of, is the person aware that they're spreading something false or misleading? And oftentimes the answer is really no. It's that same dynamic of sense making that we see in the SHARPIEGATE example that I walked through, happening about whatever topic it is, and oftentimes traversing WhatsApp, going viral through shares on WhatsApp. So I think the number one difference that makes the Brazilian election a bit more complex is that so much of the population is engaging on WhatsApp, which no outside researcher can see.
Thank you. So before we have another question in the chat, but before we go to the chat, are there any questions here in person? Okay, so let's go to the chat question.
Okay, would you say it's pragmatic to stop mis or disinformation on social media through one-by-one computer or human detection and elimination? I feel that the brute force method is not realistic and algorithms used by social media sites, so it's not promoting controversial content.
Yeah, so this has come up a bit also in the context of the whistleblower testimony over the last 2 weeks. And I was actually up this morning at 1 a.m. from 1 to 4 in the morning to testify in this UK hearing about the same question, right? Which is over in the UK, they're trying to think about what are the best ways to address false and misleading information in the context of not playing whack-a-mole reactively. They're asking some interesting questions around who is responsible for searching and creating transparency reports. And right now, there's not very much access that outside researchers have to data. So the only people who can be doing that work are the platforms. And so one of the things that we're trying to advocate for, my colleague Nate Persily at Stanford Law just introduced some legislation arguing that perhaps we should be focusing on creating mechanisms for oversight and empowering, in the US, agencies like the FTC. In the UK, it'll be their communication agency. I think I'm going to butcher the algorithm. I think it's OFCOM, Ofcom, to be the kind of responsible party overseeing the industry. One of the things that is being asked, and that a lot of us began broaching in 2018, was this question of rather than playing reactive whack-a-mole, critiquing and fact-checking individual pieces of content, might it be possible to do one of a couple different things? Could we either minimize the viral reach? So arguing, there's a phrase that Isa Raskin from Center for Humane Technology and I kind of put out into the world, which was freedom of speech. It's not freedom of speech. It's freedom of speech you have, freedom of reach you do not. This is what happens when you're up for 4 hours in the morning. So the idea of freedom of speech, not freedom of reach, was that we wanted to preserve freedom of expression, and we wanted to ensure that that there was this proliferation of voices on social platforms. But the question of what platforms algorithmically recommended or curated the reach that it gave these various pronouncements, we might think about that differently. We might think about that in terms of reducing the distribution of borderline content. And this is a thing that now, Mark Zuckerberg has also said is quite likely one of the best ways to address the situation. If you don't want people to fall into rabbit holes where they're being conscripted into these passionate online armies, one thing to do is not recommend the groups where that's happening. If you want to go find that group and you proactively search for it and you type in Army for Trump, for example, or Army for whoever into the search box, and then you go and you see it and you find it and you want to engage with it, that's fantastic. But kind of proactively surfacing the most hyperpartisan or polarizing groups might not be the best way to engender, a healthy information environment where people can kind of come to consensus and participate in the kind of activities that we've thought of as being necessary for a deliberative democracy. So I think yes, I agree with the premise of the question. I do think it's going to be changing curation and recommendation algorithms to consider more than just engagement, because oftentimes the reason those groups are promoted is because they're very, very high engagement, because people are thinking of them as like, this is my mission, this is my calling, I'm participating all the time. We saw that with the QAnon accounts, the 70,000 in the Twitter sphere that came down. They were just in there constantly because that's what they did. Their job, as they saw it, their role was to hit that amplify button over and over and over again. And I actually don't love the takedowns. I don't think the takedowns are great because they create a whole environment of a conversation about censorship that, what platforms get wrong, are they overbroad? Whereas looking at dynamics in terms of amplification, what is surfaced, what is curated for people, I think is probably the better way forward.
Thank you, Renee. Any other questions? Any questions in the chat? No other questions or comments for Renee? Thank you from Thomas. Okay, well, thank you so much for that, for the talk and for the questions and answers, Renee. We're running close to the end of our time tonight. I'd like to thank Renee for this valuable look into the 2020 election and the big lie and this long views. I encourage you to check out some more of her work. As I mentioned, there's an article that's published in The Atlantic titled "It's Not Misinformation, It's Amplified Propaganda." Really interesting look at this new term I learned about, amplifaganda. I think it's how you pronounce it, right? Really interesting and very timely work. So before we conclude, I'd like to just remind our audience, well, thank you for attending, and also think about it, consider the Media Literacy, Civic Engagement, and Democracy Project's future programming. On November 17th, we will have a community conversation where we look at some of the public opinion data on these topics and how they relate to some of the aspects of political behavior a year out from a year out from the election, and also some other important events that are pertinent to our democracy. So thank you for your attention. Thank you, Renee, for joining us and Zooming with us. We appreciate your time. And with that, thank you and good night.
Thank you.